Sometimes the most dangerous men are the quietest ones at the table. In a world where strength meant survival, Hrolf had learned that true power lies in knowing when to use it. The giant Viking sits at the feast, watching a young baker's daughter serve food with shaking hands. A stranger draws his knife at her throat. The hall goes silent. Hrolf smiles and stands up. One move later, the threat is gone forever. The hall cheers, but nobody saw how he did it. What drove this legendary warrior to risk everything for a simple serving girl? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after the feast brought a different kind of silence to Jarl Skard's great hall. Servants moved quietly among the tables, sweeping away the remnants of celebration, scattered bones, puddles of spilled mead, and the cold ashes of what had been roaring fires. The massive wooden beams overhead still held the lingering scent of roasted meat and wood smoke. But the laughter had faded with the dawn. Hrolf sat alone at the far end of the hall, his massive frame making the heavy oak bench seem delicate beneath him. His weathered hands wrapped around a simple wooden cup, steam rising from the hot broth within. At nearly 50 winters, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen enough battles to know when one was truly over and when it was merely paused. The other warriors had already departed for their mourning routines, checking livestock, mending gear, or sleeping off the previous night's revelry. But Hrolf remained watching, always watching. It was a habit formed in youth and hardened by decades of survival. Even in the safety of Jarl Skard's hall, his pale blue eyes tracked every movement, catalogued every sound. "You're up early for a man who ended a life last night," came a voice from behind him. Hrolf didn't turn. He recognized the measured footsteps of Jarl Skard approaching, the slight scrape of leather boots against the worn wooden floor. "Sleep comes harder with age," he replied, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of a man who spoke only when necessary. Skard settled onto the bench beside him, groaning slightly as his aging joints protested. At 62 winters, the Jarl had earned every line on his weathered face through leadership, diplomacy, and, when necessary, the sword. His grey beard was neatly braided with silver rings that caught the morning light filtering through the high windows. "The stranger's body has been prepared for burning," Skard said quietly. "His belongings are in my chambers, if you wish to examine them." Hrolf nodded but didn't speak. In the corner of his vision, he watched as Freydis emerged from the kitchens, carrying a wooden tray laden with fresh bread and butter. The baker's daughter moved with more confidence this morning, though her hands still trembled slightly as she arranged the food on the long table. She was perhaps 20 winters, with auburn hair that caught the firelight and green eyes that held more intelligence than many gave her credit for. Her father, Einar the baker, had sent her to work in the great hall only a moon ago, hoping to secure her a better future than the flour-dusted life of kneading dough. She had proven capable, even if the rowdy nature of Viking feasts still left her nervous. "She reminds me of my daughter at that age," Skard observed, following Hrolf's gaze. "Brave when it mattered, but still learning to trust that bravery." "Your daughter married a king," Hrolf replied. "This one serves bread to drunk warriors. This one had you willing to kill for her without hesitation," Skard countered. "That suggests she's worth more than bread and service." Hrolf finally turned to meet the Jarl's knowing gaze. Skard had been a wise leader for 30 years, and his ability to read men had kept his people alive through raids, harsh winters, and political maneuvering with neighboring clans. He saw things others missed. "Tell me about the stranger," Hrolf said, deflecting the conversation away from his own motivations. "Foreign clothes, foreign weapons, foreign accent when he spoke," Skard listed. "But he knew enough of our customs to demand guest right, and enough of our language to make his accusation understood, sent, not wandering." "That was my thought as well." They sat in comfortable silence as Freydis continued her morning work. She moved efficiently between the kitchen and the hall, bringing out fresh rushes for the floor and polishing the great brass braziers that provided warmth during the long northern nights. Occasionally, she glanced toward their corner of the hall, her expression mixing gratitude with curiosity. "She wants to thank you properly," Skard noted. "I told her you don't care for speeches or ceremony." "Good, but she also wants to understand what she witnessed last night." Hrolf's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She witnessed a drunk man make a mistake. She witnessed something that made 20 seasoned warriors freeze in place, while you moved like a man half your age with twice your reach." Skard's voice carried gentle insistence. "She witnessed precision that comes from years of killing, not years of farming." Before Hrolf could respond, the great doors of the hall swung open, admitting Bjorn Ironarm and his 2 sons. The stocky warrior stomped the mud from his boots and approached their table, his weathered face grim with news. "Ships on the horizon," he announced without preamble. 3, maybe 4, flying colors we don't recognize." Skard stood immediately, his hand instinctively moving to the sword at his hip. "How far?" "Half a day's sail, maybe less with this wind." Bjorn's eyes found Hrolf. "They're flying the Black Raven on red." The words hit the hall like a physical blow. Even Freydis, who had been arranging rushes near the hearth, stopped her work to listen. The Black Raven on red was not a banner any peaceful trader would display. It meant raiders, the kind who took what they wanted and burned what remained. Hrolf rose slowly, his massive frame unfolding with deliberate control. At his full height, he stood a head taller than most men, his broad shoulders and scarred arms speaking of countless battles. Despite years of relative peace in Skardi's service, his body remained hard and ready. "How many men in your count?" he asked Bjorn. "Each ship could carry 40, maybe 50 warriors." Bjorn's expression darkened. "But these aren't typical longships. They're built for war, not raiding. Heavy shields, extra armor." Skard's mind was already working through defensive strategies. The hall could hold perhaps 200 people if they packed everyone inside, but it wasn't built to withstand a siege. Their warriors numbered 37, counting every man who could swing a sword. "We need to send word to the allied clans," the Jarl decided. "Bjorn, take your fastest son and ride to Harald's hall. Tell him we invoke the old agreements." As the men began discussing fortifications and message runners, Hrolf found himself watching Freydis again. She had resumed her work, but her movements were sharper now, more focused. The news of approaching danger had not sent her fleeing to her father's house. Instead, she seemed to be mentally cataloguing supplies and defensible positions. "You should go to your father," Hrolf said, approaching her corner of the hall. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "Should I? This hall will become dangerous very soon." "It was dangerous last night," she replied, continuing to arrange the rushes in neat piles. "You made it safe." Hrolf studied her face, searching for the fear that should have been there. Instead, he found determination mixed with something that might have been trust. "It was a dangerous combination in someone so young. Last night was one drunk fool," he said carefully. "What's coming will be organized men with organized weapons and organized killing. Then we'll need organized defenders." She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "My father can bake bread for the fighters. I can help prepare the hall for what's coming." Before Hrolf could argue, she walked away toward the kitchen, her step firm and purposeful. He found himself both impressed and worried by her resolve. In his experience, courage in the young often led to unnecessary graves. "She's stronger than she looks," Skard observed, joining him near the hearth. Her grandmother was Astrid Shieldbearer, one of the few women who fought alongside King Eric in the northern campaigns. That explained much about the steel he'd glimpsed in her green eyes. Warrior blood ran deep in Viking families, even when it skipped generations or flowed through different paths. "The stranger's belongings," Hrolf said, returning to practical matters. "I'll examine them now." Skard's private chambers lay behind the great hall, reached through a heavy door reinforced with iron bands. The room was spartanly furnished. A massive bed, a wooden desk scarred by years of use, and several chests containing the Jarl's most valuable possessions. On the desk, carefully arranged, were the dead stranger's effects. The dagger that had threatened Freydis was there, its blade still stained with the man's blood. Hrolf picked it up, testing its weight and balance. The craftsmanship was excellent, too excellent for a common bandit or wandering drunk. The steel was folded in a pattern he recognized, a technique used by smiths in the eastern kingdoms. Foreign-made, he confirmed, setting the blade aside. Expensive foreign-made. The man's clothes told a similar story. His leather jerkin was of good quality, but showed hard use. His boots were well crafted, but worn thin at the heels from long walking. This was a man who traveled extensively, but was well funded for his journeys. What's this? Skard pointed to a small object that had been hidden in the stranger's belt pouch. Hrolf lifted the item carefully. It was a silver pendant, roughly forged, and bearing a symbol he hadn't seen in many years, a wolf's head surrounded by runic letters. His blood went cold as memory flooded back, bringing with it the weight of old choices and older enemies. "Do you recognize it?" Skard asked, noting the change in Hrolf's expression. "Perhaps." Hrolf's voice was carefully neutral, but his knuckles had gone white where they gripped the pendant. "I need time to consider what this might mean." Before Skard could press for details, a commotion erupted from the great hall. Shouts and running footsteps echoed through the wooden walls, followed by the deep blast of a warning horn. Both men grabbed their weapons and rushed toward the sound. In the hall, chaos reigned. Bjorn had returned faster than expected, his face flushed with exertion and fear. Warriors were arming themselves, while servants ran to secure valuable items. In the center of the activity, Freydis stood calmly organizing the evacuation of non-essential supplies, her voice cutting through the noise with surprising authority. "What news?" Skard demanded. "The ships have beached," Bjorn gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "They landed at Seal Point, 3 hours' march from here." Harold's men counted at least 150 warriors, all armed for war. Hrolf felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came before battle. Around him, men were strapping on armor and checking weapons, their faces grim but determined. The time for questions and investigation had passed. Now came the time for steel and blood. "They'll reach us by nightfall," Skard said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "We have perhaps 6 hours to prepare." As the Jarl began issuing orders for fortification, Hrolf found himself staring at the silver pendant still clutched in his palm. The wolf's head seemed to mock him, dredging up memories he had spent years trying to bury. If his suspicions were correct, the approaching enemy knew exactly who they would find in Jarl Skard's hall. This was no random raid. This was a reckoning 20 years in the making. He closed his fist around the pendant and began to plan for war. The silver pendant felt heavier than it should have as Hrolf made his way through the bustling hall. Warriors sharpened blades, while women packed essential supplies, but he barely noticed the activity around him. His mind was 20 years in the past, remembering a different battle and a different enemy who had worn this same symbol. In his modest cottage at the edge of the settlement, Hrolf moved with practiced efficiency. From beneath loose floorboards, he retrieved items he had hoped never to use again. His war axe came first, two-handed, double-bladed, with a handle worn smooth by countless battles. The leather wrapping was cracked with age, but the steel remained pristine. He had spent too many nights maintaining it to let rust or neglect claim this particular friend. Next came the chainmail, still flexible despite its age. The rings had been forged by master smiths in the south, each link tested to withstand the bite of enemy steel. As he pulled it over his head, the familiar weight settled across his shoulders like an old burden willingly accepted. Last was the helmet, scarred and dented but still functional. A wolf's head was carved into the front plate, its eyes set with small garnets that caught the light. It was the mark of his former life, when men had called him by a different name and enemies had whispered prayers when they heard he was coming. A soft knock interrupted his preparations. "Hrolf?" Freydis' voice came through the door. "Jarl Skard sent me to ask if you need assistance with anything." He paused, considering whether to send her away. Instead, he found himself opening the door. She stood in the afternoon light, holding a cloth-wrapped bundle that smelled of fresh bread and salted meat. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, then stopped as she took in his appearance. The transformation from quiet hall member to armored warrior was striking. "You look different." "I am different." He accepted the food bundle, noting how her eyes lingered on the wolf head helmet. "You should return to the hall. Help with the preparations there. What is that symbol?" she asked, pointing to the carved wolf. "I've seen it before, in old stories my grandmother told." Hrolf's jaw tightened. If her grandmother had been Astrid's shield-bearer, she would indeed know the old stories. The tales of the ghost wolf were still told around winter fires, though most people believed them to be myths, stories from before you were born, he said carefully. "My grandmother said the ghost wolf was the fiercest warrior who ever lived, that he could kill 10 men before they could draw their swords, that he disappeared after the great battle at Raven's Rock and was never seen again. She was too observant for her own good." Hrolf stepped outside and closed the door behind him, the weight of his armor making no sound as he moved. "Your grandmother told many stories. Was she lying about this one?" Before he could answer, the sound of approaching hooves echoed across the settlement. A rider was coming hard from the direction of the coast, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. The entire settlement seemed to hold its breath as the messenger reached the great hall. "They're coming!" the rider shouted, sliding from his mount before it had fully stopped. 3 hours, maybe less. And they're flying more banners now. I count at least 5 different clans working together. Hrolf felt the familiar chill that preceded battle. 5 clans meant this was more than a raid. This was an army assembled for a specific purpose. His grip tightened on the silver pendant still hidden in his palm. Jarl Skard emerged from the hall, already armored and carrying his grandfather's sword. "How many total?" 200, possibly more," the messenger gasped. "And they're not stopping to set up a proper camp. They're marching straight for us." The implications were clear to every warrior present. A direct assault meant confidence, the kind that came from superior numbers and advanced knowledge of their target's defenses. This enemy knew exactly what they were facing and believed they could overwhelm it through sheer force. "Hrolf," Skada called out, "we need to speak privately." They gathered in the Jarl's chambers along with his senior warriors, Bjorn Ironarm, Olaf the Tall, and Magnus Swordbreaker. These were men who had fought beside Skada for decades, earning their positions through loyalty and skill. "Show them," Skard said simply. Hrolf placed the silver pendant on the wooden table. The wolf's head seemed to gleam with malevolent life in the lamplight, its runic inscriptions dark against the polished metal. "Fenris Brotherhood," Magnus whispered, recognizing the symbol immediately. "But they were destroyed 20 years ago." "Their leaders were destroyed," Hrolf corrected. "Apparently, some of the followers survived." Olaf leaned forward, studying the pendant more closely. "This is why they're coming. Old blood feuds?" "Not old," Hrolf said quietly. "Very personal." The silence stretched as the implications sank in. The Fenris Brotherhood had been a confederation of outlaw clans who rejected traditional Viking codes of honor. They had practiced dark arts, tortured prisoners, and shown no mercy to women or children. The war against them had been brutal and necessary. "Who knows?" Skard asked. "Only us for now." Hrolf straightened, decision made. "But they'll learn soon enough when the fighting starts." "What do you mean?" Bjorn asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected. Hrolf removed his helmet and set it on the table beside the pendant. The wolf's head carving caught the light, and understanding dawned on the faces around him. "Sweet Thor's hammer," Olaf breathed. "You're him. You're the ghost wolf." "I was him," Hrolf corrected. "I retired from that life." "Men like you don't retire," Magnus said, awe and fear mixing in his voice. "The ghost wolf doesn't just disappear." "He did disappear," Hrolf replied firmly. "He found peace in this hall, serving a good jarl and protecting good people. He became someone else. And now?" Skard asked. Hrolf looked at each man in turn, seeing the weight of realization settling on their shoulders. They had been living alongside a legend without knowing it. The most feared warrior of their generation had been quietly sharing their meals and tending their defenses. Now, he has to remember how to be what he was, Hrolf said simply, because the alternative is watching everyone in this hall die. The sound of running feet interrupted their conference. A young warrior burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement and terror. "Jarl! They're sending a herald, a single rider with a white banner." The men exchanged glances. A herald meant the enemy wanted to talk before the fighting began. In Hrolf's experience, that usually meant they wanted to offer terms, surrender now or face complete destruction. They gathered on the wooden platform outside the great hall as the herald approached. He was a young man, perhaps 25 winters, with the lean build of a scout rather than a heavy warrior. His horse was good stock, and his equipment suggested he served someone with substantial resources. "I seek Jarl Skarde," the herald called out when he was within speaking distance. "I am Skarde," the Jarl replied. "Speak your message." "My lord Ragnar Bloodeye sends greetings," the herald began formally. "He offers you this choice. Surrender the one called Hrolf, who serves in your hall, and your people will be spared. Refuse, and every man, woman, and child will be put to the sword." The name hit Hrolf like a physical blow. Ragnar Bloodeye, younger brother of Grim the Destroyer, whom Hrolf had killed in single combat at Raven's Rock. The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. This wasn't just about old grudges. This was about family honor and blood debt. "What proof do you offer that your lord will honor such terms?" Skard asked, playing for time while his mind worked through options. "The proof of his mercy," the herald replied. "He seeks only the ghost wolf. Give him up and the rest live." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. The name Ghost Wolf carried weight even here in this peaceful settlement. Old stories suddenly seemed less mythical when connected to the quiet man who had lived among them. "Tell your lord," Skard said slowly, "that we do not surrender our people to satisfy old grudges. If he wants war, he shall have it." The herald nodded as if he had expected this answer. "Then prepare for battle. We attack at sunset." As the messenger rode away, Hrolf felt the familiar coldness settling over him, the mental preparation that preceded violence. Around him, people were staring with mixtures of awe, fear, and speculation. The secret he had guarded for 5 years was now common knowledge. "Is it true?" a voice asked from the crowd. Freydis had pushed forward, her green eyes fixed on his face. "Are you really him?" Hrolf met her gaze steadily. I am. I suppose it doesn't matter anymore." "It matters," she said firmly. "It means we have a chance." Her faith in a legend she barely understood touched something deep in his chest. These people, Skarde, Freydis, even gruff old Bjorn, had become his family in ways he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. The thought of watching them die while he could prevent it was unbearable. "Yes," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "We have a chance." But as he looked toward the horizon where enemy banners would soon appear, Hrolf wondered if the ghost wolf still lived inside him after 5 years of peace, or if that deadly warrior had truly died at Raven's Rock along with so many others. The great horn of Jarl Skard had not sounded the call to war in 15 years. When its deep, resonant voice rolled across the valleys and fjords, every man who heard it knew that death was riding toward their homes. The ancient instrument, carved from the tusk of a legendary whale and bound with silver rings, carried the weight of generations. It was a sound that demanded everything from those who heard it. Hrolf stood on the platform outside the great hall, watching as riders thundered away in all directions. They carried the call to allied clans scattered across the region. Harold the Bold, Eric Stonefist, and others who had sworn oaths of mutual defense in better times. Whether they would arrive before the battle began remained uncertain, but the horn's call would be honored. Viking word was sacred. Even when honoring it meant riding into certain death. "How many will come?" Freydis asked, joining him at the platform's edge. She had traded her servant's apron for practical clothes, wool leggings, a leather jerkin, and sturdy boots. Her auburn hair was braided back in a style that wouldn't interfere with work or fighting. "Enough," Hrolf replied, though privately he doubted it. Even if every allied clan sent their full strength, they would still be outnumbered. "Your father, where is he?" "Baking battle bread," she said with a slight smile. "He says men fight better on full stomachs, and he's probably right." Around them, the settlement transformed as preparations accelerated. Women and children who couldn't fight were being moved to the most defensible positions. Weapons were distributed to anyone capable of swinging them. The blacksmith's forge roared constantly as old blades were sharpened and new spearheads hammered into shape. "You should be with the other non-combatants," Hrolf said, though he suspected he already knew her response. "Should I?" She turned to face him fully, and he saw the same steel in her green eyes that had been there when the stranger threatened her. "My grandmother didn't hide when enemies came to her hall. Your grandmother was a trained shield maiden with 20 years of combat experience. Everyone starts somewhere." Before Hrolf could argue further, the sound of approaching hooves announced the arrival of the first allied response. Harold the Bold rode into the settlement with 30 warriors, their weapons gleaming and their faces grim with the knowledge of what they faced. Harold himself was a mountain of a man, nearly matching Hrolf's height and carrying scars from a dozen campaigns. "Scarred," Harold bellowed, dismounting near the great hall. "We came as soon as we heard the horn. What enemy brings war to our lands?" The reunion was brief but warm. These men had fought together before, trusted each other with their lives and the lives of their families. As Scarred explained the situation, Hrolf found himself studying the new arrivals. They were good warriors, well-equipped and experienced, but he could see the uncertainty in their faces when they learned who they were truly fighting for. "The Ghost Wolf," Harold said quietly, his eyes finding Hrolf in the crowd. "I thought that was just a name from the old songs." "The songs were true," Scarred replied. "He's been living among us for 5 years. Harold approached Hrolf with the careful respect due to legend. "My father fought at Raven's Rock. He said you moved like death itself, that no man could stand against you. Your father was a good man," Hrolf replied, remembering the grizzled warrior who had helped break the Fenris Brotherhood's final charge. "He saved many lives that day, as did you, by all accounts." Harold extended his hand. "It's an honor to fight beside you again." The handshake was firm, carrying the weight of shared purpose. Around them, Harold's men were integrating with the local defenders, sharing information about weapons and tactics. The presence of allied warriors lifted spirits, but Hrolf knew the mathematics of battle remained grim. "More will come," Harold assured him, noting his expression. "Eric's riders should arrive within the hour, and word has gone out to the coastal clans as well." As if summoned by his words, another group of horsemen appeared on the horizon. Eric Stonefist led 25 warriors, his famous warhammer strapped across his back. Behind him came smaller groups from other allied settlements, men who had left their own defenses weak to answer Scarred's call. By late afternoon, nearly 80 additional warriors had arrived. Combined with Scarred's original 37 men, they now had over 100 defenders. It was still insufficient against the approaching army, but it meant the enemy would pay dearly for their victory. "We need to discuss strategy," Scarred announced as the sun began its descent toward the western hills. "Gather the war leaders." They assembled in the great hall around the long table where Hrolf had sat peacefully just that morning. Maps were spread, showing the approaches to the settlement, marked with defensive positions and potential choke points. The conversation was professional but tense, experienced warriors discussing how to make their deaths as costly as possible. "They'll come from the east," Harold stated, pointing to the most obvious route. "The ground there favors attackers, unless we give them a reason to approach differently," Hrolf said, speaking for the first time since the planning began. "What if we appear to retreat toward the western ridge?" Eric studied the map more closely. "Draw them into the narrow passage between the rocks? That could work, but only if we can convince them we're fleeing rather than maneuvering. They expect to find a legendary warrior," Hrolf continued. "If instead they find what appears to be a disorganized retreat, they might become overconfident." The plan that emerged was risky but sound. A small force would make a visible withdrawal toward the western rocks, apparently abandoning the settlement in panic. The main body of defenders would be hidden in prepared positions, ready to strike when the enemy committed to pursuit. "What about the hall itself?" Magnus asked. "If they take it, they can have it," Scarred interrupted. "Buildings can be rebuilt. People cannot, As the war council dispersed to brief their men, Hrolf found himself alone with Freydis again. She had remained throughout the planning session, listening intently to discussions of tactics and timing. "You're going to be part of the visible retreat," she said. "It wasn't a question. Someone has to sell the deception," he replied. "If they see the ghost wolf running, they'll believe the rest are truly broken. And if something goes wrong, if they catch you before you reach the rocks?" Hrolf was quiet for a moment, considering how much truth to share. "Then the legend dies, as it should have 20 years ago." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have." She stepped closer. Close enough that he could see the worry in her green eyes despite her brave words. "My grandmother used to say that legends don't die easily. They have too much left to protect." Before he could respond, a commotion outside announced the arrival of the final group of allies. These were coastal warriors, men who spent their lives fighting storms and sea monsters. Their leader was Gunnar Wavewalker, an old friend whose presence lifted Hrolf's spirits considerably. "You magnificent bastard," Gunnar said by way of greeting, clasping Hrolf's arm. 5 years I've been wondering where you vanished to, and here you are playing farmer." "It was peaceful," Hrolf replied with the ghost of a smile. "Peace is overrated," Gunnar grinned. "Besides, I brought you a gift." He gestured to his men, who were unloading something from their pack horses. Hrolf's breath caught as he recognized the carefully wrapped bundle. It was his old war gear, the armor and weapons he had left behind when he chose exile over glory. "How did you—" "I've been keeping them safe," Gunnar said simply. "Call it faith that you'd need them again someday." As Hrolf unwrapped the familiar equipment, he felt the last of his peaceful existence slipping away. The armor was heavier than he remembered, the weapons more perfectly balanced. This was the gear of the Ghost Wolf, crafted by master smiths and blessed by victory in countless battles. "The enemy will be here within the hour," Harold reported, returning from his scouts. "Everyone needs to be in position soon." Hrolf nodded, pulling on the legendary armor that had become his second skin in darker days. Around him, warriors made their final preparations, sharpening blades, checking armor straps, and offering quiet prayers to whatever gods might listen. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, the settlement fell into an expectant hush. The trap was set, the players in position. All that remained was to see whether the Ghost Wolf could rise from 5 years of peaceful, a death to protect the people who had become his unexpected family. The enemy appeared on the eastern ridge like a dark stain, spreading across the landscape. Even at distance, their numbers were impressive, banners streaming in the evening wind, armor glinting in the fading light, and the steady thunder of hundreds of boots marching in unison. Ragnar Bloodeye had assembled a force worthy of conquering kingdoms, all focused on killing one man. Freydis stood beside Hrolf on the wooden platform, her hand resting on the small eating knife at her belt. The weapon was pitifully inadequate against armored warriors, but her grandmother's silver locket hung around her neck like a talisman. Inside, a pressed flower from her homeland reminded her that women of her bloodline had faced impossible odds before. "Tell me about her," Hrolf said quietly, nodding toward the locket. "Your grandmother, Astrid Shieldbearer, fought in the war against the Ice Kings," Freydis replied, her voice steady despite the approaching army. "She was 16 when she first picked up a sword, 25 when she died defending the pass at Frozen Falls." "I knew her," Hrolf said, surprising her. "Not well, but I fought alongside her unit during the siege of Winter's Hold. She saved my life once." Freydis turned to stare at him. "You never said—" "There are many things I never said." He adjusted the straps of his legendary armor, the familiar weight settling across his shoulders like an old burden willingly accepted. "She would be proud of you, for trembling like a leaf while death approaches, for standing here at all." The sound of war horns echoed across the valley as the enemy force began their descent. Ragnar's army moved with professional discipline, scouts ranging ahead while the main body maintained formation. These weren't desperate raiders or undisciplined berserkers. They were seasoned warriors following a carefully planned assault. "Time to go," Harold called from below. The allied war leaders had gathered for final instructions, their faces grim but determined. Everyone knows their positions? The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Hrolf would lead a small group in a visible retreat toward the western rocks, drawing the enemy into pursuit. The main force would remain hidden until the attackers committed to the narrow passage. Then strike from concealed positions on both flanks. Remember, Hrolf addressed the gathered warriors, sell the panic. Make them believe we're broken and fleeing. Let greed and overconfidence work for us. What about her? Bjorn Ironarm pointed toward Freydis. She shouldn't be anywhere near the fighting. She'll be with the retreat group, Hrolf said, making the decision in that moment. Someone needs to help maintain the deception, and she knows the western passages better than most. Freydis straightened, understanding that this was both protection and responsibility. If she was with Hrolf's group, he could watch over her. But she would also be expected to play her part in the dangerous game they were about to begin. I can do it, she said simply. The defenders dispersed to their positions as the enemy army reached the valley floor. Hrolf's retreat group consisted of 12 warriors chosen for speed and intelligence, rather than pure fighting ability. They needed to look like panicked survivors, not a disciplined rear guard. Strip off anything that looks too organized, Hrolf instructed. Carry your weapons like you grabbed them in haste. Remember, we're terrified farmers, not prepared warriors. Magnus Swordbreaker removed his helmet and mussed his hair. Olaf the Tall slung his shield incorrectly, making it appear he had never properly trained with the equipment. Even experienced warriors had to work to look incompetent, but the deception was crucial. Freydis watched the transformation with fascination. These men who had seemed so confident moments before now appeared genuinely panicked. Only Hrolf remained unchanged. His bearing still carried the subtle menace of a predator. Even when he tried to disguise it, "You'll need to look more frightened," she told him quietly. "I'm working on it," he replied with the ghost of a smile. The first enemy scouts appeared at the settlement's edge as the sun touched the horizon. They moved cautiously, expecting traps and resistance. Instead, they found what appeared to be hasty abandonment, doors left open, cooking fires still burning, valuable items scattered as if dropped in panic. "Now," Hrolf whispered. His group emerged from behind the great hall, moving with apparent disorder toward the western ridge. Freydis clutched a bundle of supplies while looking fearfully over her shoulder. The warriors stumbled and cursed, playing their roles perfectly. The enemy scouts saw them immediately. Signal horns sounded as word spread back to the main force. The defenders were fleeing, apparently broken by the mere sight of Ragnar's army. It was exactly the response Hrolf had hoped for. "There!" a voice shouted in accented Norse. "The big one, that must be him." Even at distance, Hrolf's size and bearing marked him as the legendary Ghost Wolf. The sight of him apparently running in terror would be irresistible to an enemy who had come so far for revenge. "Keep moving," Hrolf muttered to his group. "Let them see our backs, but don't move so fast they can't follow." Behind them, the enemy army poured into the settlement like water through a broken dam. Buildings were searched and secured, but the real prize lay ahead. The legendary warrior who seemed to be fleeing toward the rocky hills. "They're taking the bait," Magnus observed, glancing back at the pursuing force. "Looks like maybe 60 men breaking off to follow us. Good odds for the main ambush," Hrolf replied. "Bad odds for us if this goes wrong." The western passage was a natural corridor between two steep rock faces, barely wide enough for 4 men to walk abreast. It offered excellent defensive positions for anyone who reached it first, but getting there alive would require precise timing. "How much farther?" Freydis asked, her breathing already labored from the quick pace. "Half a mile," Hrolf replied. "Can you manage it?" "I can manage anything required." Her determination reminded him painfully of her grandmother. Astrid had possessed the same fierce will, the same refusal to accept defeat even when facing impossible odds. The memory gave him both comfort and concern. Courage in battle was admirable, but it could also lead to unnecessary sacrifice. The pursuit was gaining ground slowly, but steadily. The enemy had committed significant forces to the chase, convinced they were about to capture the most wanted man in the northern kingdoms. Their eagerness was palpable, driving them forward faster than caution would normally allow. "Perfect," Hrolf said with satisfaction. "Greed makes men stupid." As they reached the mouth of the passage, the sound of battle horns echoed from the settlement behind them. The main ambush had been triggered, Skard's hidden warriors striking the enemy flanks while they were focused on the apparent retreat. "Phase 1 complete," Magnus panted. "Now comes the hard part." Hrolf drew his legendary war axe as the first pursuers appeared at the passage entrance. The weapon felt perfectly balanced in his hands, as if no time had passed since he last wielded it in anger. The ghost wolf was awakening after 5 years of peaceful sleep, and enemies were about to remember why his name had once struck terror into the hearts of armies. "Remember," he told his small band of defenders, "we hold this passage no matter what. Everything depends on it." The battle for the Western Rocks was about to begin. The golden arm ring was discovered by pure chance, hidden beneath a loose stone in the foundation of the Great Hall. Freydis found it while helping to secure the last of the valuable items before the retreat, her fingers brushing against the ornate metal as she reached for a fallen coin. The moment she lifted it into the firelight, she knew it didn't belong to anyone in Skard's household. The craftsmanship was foreign, elaborate knotwork patterns surrounding a central design of intertwined serpents. Most telling were the runic inscriptions along the inner band, words in the old tongue that spoke of loyalty bought and sold. This was not a simple piece of jewelry, but a mark of allegiance to whoever paid the highest price. "Hrolf!" she called softly, drawing his attention from the weapons he was checking. "Look at this." He took the ring and examined it carefully, his expression growing darker as understanding dawned. The serpent design was the mark of Ragnar Bloodeye's personal guard, men who swore oaths not to clan or king, but to gold and the promise of rich rewards. Whoever had worn this ring was not just an enemy sympathizer, but a paid agent. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Under the foundation stone near the Jarl's sleeping quarters." Freydis pointed to the spot, her mind working through the implications. Someone who had regular access to that area, someone trusted enough to move freely through the hall. Around them, the sounds of preparation continued as warriors made final adjustments to their equipment. But beneath the surface activity, a more dangerous realization was taking hold. The enemy had detailed knowledge of their defenses, their numbers, even their battle plans. That level of intelligence could only come from within. "We need to tell Skard," Magnus said, having overheard the conversation. "No," Hrolf replied sharply. "Not yet. If there's a traitor among us, announcing our discovery could force them into desperate action. Then what do we do?" Freydis asked. "We watch. We remember who was where when decisions were made. And we pray we figure out who it is before they can do more damage." The immediate crisis of the approaching army had to take precedence. But the knowledge of betrayal added a new layer of tension to their already desperate situation. Trust was the foundation of Viking society. When that crumbled, everything else followed. The enemy pursuit force reached the mouth of the Western Passage just as the last light faded from the sky. Torches blazed along their line, creating a river of fire in the darkness. 60 men, as Magnus had estimated, all eager to claim the bounty on the ghost wolf's head. "Form up," Hrolf commanded quietly. His small band of defenders took positions among the rocks, using every advantage the terrain offered. The passage was narrow enough that numbers mattered less than skill and positioning. Freydis crouched behind a boulder near the rear of their formation, her grandmother's locket pressed against her heart. The small eating knife in her hand felt pitifully inadequate, but her role was survival, not heroics. She needed to live long enough to help identify the traitor. The first enemy warrior entered the passage cautiously, shield raised and spear ready. He was young, perhaps 25 winters, with the lean build of a scout. His eyes swept the rocks above, searching for hidden archers. "Steady," Hrolf whispered to his men. "Let them commit." More enemies followed the scout, their confidence growing as no immediate attack materialized. The ghost wolf's reputation was fearsome, but these rocks looked empty. Perhaps the legendary warrior was truly broken, reduced to cowering among stones like a common fugitive. When 15 men had entered the passage, Hrolf gave the signal. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Warriors emerged from concealed positions above and to the sides, weapons gleaming in the torchlight. The narrow confines that had seemed like protection became a trap as enemies found themselves unable to maneuver effectively. Hrolf's war axe took the first man's head cleanly, the blade singing through the air with deadly precision. For a moment, the legendary ghost wolf stood revealed in all his terrible glory, armor scarred by countless battles, eyes cold as winter ice, moving with the fluid grace of a born killer. The enemy formation shattered as panic set in. These men had heard the stories, but seeing the legend in action was different from imagining it. The ghost wolf fought like death incarnate, his axe weaving patterns of destruction that left enemies broken and bleeding. "Hold the line!" an enemy officer shouted, trying to restore order. "He's only one man." But his words rang hollow as Hrolf proved that some men were worth more than others. Magnus and Olaf fought beside him with deadly efficiency, their weapons coordinated in a dance of destruction they had practiced for years. The narrow passage became a killing ground. Freydis watched in fascination and horror as the peaceful man she had served meals to transformed into something barely human. The ghost wolf was beautiful and terrifying, graceful and brutal, a perfect killing machine wrapped in human form. Then she saw him, a familiar figure among the enemy ranks, someone who should not have been there. Her blood went cold as recognition hit like a physical blow. Thorwald Ironbeard, one of Skard's most trusted warriors, stood at the back of the enemy formation. He wore enemy colors and carried enemy weapons, but his face was unmistakable. He had been part of the War Council, privy to their battle plans, trusted with their lives. "Hrolf!" she called out, pointing toward the traitor. He followed her gaze and saw Thorwald attempting to retreat from the battle. Their eyes met across the chaos of combat, and understanding passed between them like lightning. The traitor realized he had been discovered. What happened next moved with nightmarish speed. Thorwald drew a horn from his belt and blew 3 sharp blasts, a signal that would bring the main enemy force rushing to the passage. The ambush at the settlement would be abandoned as Ragnar's army converged on their position. "Kill him!" Magnus roared, trying to fight through the press of enemies, but Thorwald was already moving, using his knowledge of the terrain to escape through a route only locals would know. The damage was done. Their careful trap had become a snare, closing around them instead. "Fall back," Hrolf commanded grimly. The secondary positions now. As his warriors began a fighting retreat deeper into the rocky maze, Freydis felt the weight of disaster settling over them. The traitor's signal would bring overwhelming force to bear on their small group. They had lost the advantage of surprise and position in a single moment of betrayal. "Can we still win?" she asked as they reached a natural choke point between 2 massive stones. Hrolf's smile was grim, but determined. "We can still make them pay." The sound of approaching reinforcements echoed through the night as Ragnar's full army abandoned their assault on the settlement to pursue the real prize. The ghost wolf was trapped among the western rocks, and every enemy warrior wanted to claim the glory of his death. The final battle was about to begin. The Blood Eagle banner appeared above the rocky ridgeline like a harbinger of doom, its crimson fabric snapping in the night wind. The feared symbol, a stylized eagle with wings spread over the broken bodies of enemies, struck terror into the hearts of those who knew its meaning. Ragnar Blood-Eye's forces had adopted the most dreaded practice of the old ways, promising a death so horrible that strong men would beg for simple beheading instead. Freydis pressed herself against the cold stone, watching as torches multiplied along the heights above them. The main enemy army had arrived with terrifying speed, abandoning their assault on the settlement to converge on this narrow passage. Her worst fears were confirmed when she recognized Thorwald's distinctive horn call echoing from multiple positions. The traitor was directing the enemy placement with intimate Knowledge of every defensive position. How many? Magnus whispered, his weathered face grim in the flickering torchlight. All of them, Hrolf replied simply, studying the encircling forces with professional detachment. Ragnar committed everything to this moment. The tactical situation was desperate, beyond normal measure. Their small band of 12 defenders faced nearly 200 enemies who now held the high ground and knew the terrain. The careful ambush that should have broken the enemy assault had collapsed into a trap that threatened to destroy them all. We could surrender, Olaf suggested quietly. Offer terms. No, Hrolf's voice carried absolute finality. You know what that banner means. Ragnar didn't come this far to accept surrender. The Blood Eagle was not just a symbol, but a promise. Enemies captured under that banner faced ritual torture designed to break both body and spirit before death finally claimed them. It was a fate so horrible that Viking warriors would fight to their last breath rather than risk it. Freydis found herself studying Hrolf's profile as he assessed their hopeless position. The peaceful man who had shared quiet meals in the Great Hall had vanished completely, replaced by something altogether more dangerous. The ghost wolf stood before her in all his terrible glory, scarred armor reflecting torchlight, ancient weapons ready for one final battle, eyes holding the cold calculation of a legendary killer. Do you regret it? She asked quietly. Giving up your peaceful life for this? He turned to look at her, and for a moment she saw past the warrior's mask to the man beneath. Peaceful lives are built on the graves of those willing to fight for them. I never forgot that. I just hoped I was done being one of the fighters. And now I remember why legends matter. He straightened, decision made. When they sing songs of this night, they'll remember that the ghost wolf died protecting something worth protecting. The first enemy probe came from the east, a dozen warriors attempting to test their defenses under cover of darkness. Hrolf met them at the narrow throat of the passage, his war axe carving bloody patterns in the night air. The legendary weapon moved like living lightning, each strike precisely placed to maximize damage and terror. But even as enemies fell before his blade, more kept coming. The sheer weight of numbers was overwhelming, pressing against their small line like an avalanche of steel and fury. Magnus took a spear thrust through his shoulder, while Olaf bled from a dozen minor cuts. Fall back to the secondary position, Hrolf commanded. His voice cutting through the chaos. They retreated deeper into the rocky maze, using every choke point and defensive position the terrain offered. But Thorwald's knowledge worked against them. The traitor guided enemy forces around their flanks, negating the advantages they had counted on. There, Freydis pointed to a narrow ledge above them. Thorwald! He's signaling again. The traitor stood silhouetted against the night sky, using a metal mirror to flash coded signals to enemy commanders. His betrayal was complete and methodical, selling every advantage they possessed for whatever price Ragnar had offered. I can reach him, Magnus said, gauging the distance to the ledge. No, Hrolf replied firmly. We need you here. Let him signal. It changes nothing now, but the betrayal cut deeper than tactical considerations. These men had fought together for years, trusting each other with their lives and the lives of their families. Thorwald's treachery violated every bond that held Viking society together. The next assault came from 3 directions simultaneously, coordinated by the traitor's signals. Enemy warriors poured into the passage like a flood of death, their weapons gleaming in the torchlight. The defenders met them with desperate fury, but the outcome was inevitable. We're being pushed back too fast, Olaf panted. Blood streaming from a cut above his eye. Hold here, Hrolf commanded, indicating a natural fortress formed by 3 massive boulders. This is where we make our stand. As his men took positions among the rocks, Freydis found herself face to face with a choice she had never expected to make. The small eating knife in her hand was pitiful against armored warriors. But her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper from the silver locket. Courage was not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. What do you need me to do? She asked. Hrolf looked at her with something that might have been pride.
Survive this.
Live to tell them what happened here. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give. The final assault began with a roar that shook the very stones around them. Ragnar Bloodeye himself led the charge, his massive frame encased in black armor, decorated with silver skulls. The enemy chieftain had come to claim his prize personally, unwilling to trust such an important kill to subordinates. "Ghost Wolf," Ragnar's voice boomed across the passage. "Face me in single combat. Your death for the lives of your companions." The offer hung in the night air like a challenge from the gods themselves. Every warrior present understood the significance. Single combat between champions was sacred, binding even enemies in honor. If Hrolf accepted and lost, his companions would be spared. If he refused, they would all die under the Blood Eagle banner. "Don't," Freydis whispered, understanding the terrible choice he faced, but Hrolf was already moving forward, war axe gleaming in his hands. The Ghost Wolf walked toward his final battle with the steady confidence of a man who had always known this moment would come. Behind him, his small band of defenders watched in awe and terror as legend prepared to meet legend in mortal combat. "I accept," Hrolf called out, his voice carrying across the passage. "Single combat by the old laws. Your vengeance against my life." Ragnar Bloodeye smiled, revealing teeth filed to sharp points in the manner of berserker chieftains. "Finally, I've waited 20 years for this moment." The circle formed naturally as warriors from both sides drew back to create space for the duel. Ancient traditions demanded witness to such contests, ensuring that songs would be sung and stories told regardless of the outcome. As the two legends faced each other in the flickering torchlight, Freydis felt the weight of history settling around them. This was how the old songs began, with heroes making impossible choices in the face of certain death. The moment Hrolf reached for the leather cord around his neck, the entire atmosphere of the rocky passage changed. Warriors who had been preparing for single combat suddenly fell silent, their eyes fixed on what he was revealing. The berserker's tooth necklace emerged from beneath his armor like a relic from the darkest legends of the north. Each tooth was the size of a man's thumb, yellowed with age, but still gleaming in the torchlight. There were 13 of them in total, each one taken from a different legendary battle where the Ghost Wolf had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. The largest tooth, centermost on the cord, had belonged to Grim the Destroyer himself, Ragnar's older brother, and the most feared berserker of his generation. "You kept it," Ragnar breathed, his filed teeth gleaming as recognition dawned. "All these years you kept my brother's tooth." "I kept them all," Hrolf replied quietly, lifting the necklace so every warrior present could see it clearly. "The Frost Giant of Ironhold, the Demon of Black Harbor, the Skull King of the Eastern Wastes. Your brother was merely the 13th. A collective gasp rose from both sides of the conflict. The berserker's tooth necklace was more than jewelry. It was proof of identity that could not be forged or stolen. Only the Ghost Wolf himself could wear it, because only he had personally killed every creature whose tooth hung upon that cord. Freydis felt her understanding of the man she had served breakfast to crumble and rebuild itself. The stories her grandmother had told were not exaggerated tales meant to entertain children. If anything, they had understated the reality. The Ghost Wolf was not just a legendary warrior, he was the most feared killer in the history of the Northern Kingdoms. 13 legendary battles, Magnus whispered in awe. 13 monsters that armies couldn't kill, and he faced them alone. "Not alone," Hrolf corrected, his eyes never leaving Ragnar's face. "I had good men beside me in each fight, men who died so that others could live safely, including the battle where my brother fell," Ragnar snarled, his massive sword sliding from its sheath. "Raven's Rock, where you destroyed the Fenris Brotherhood and everything it stood for." "Your brother chose his path," Hrolf replied with deadly calm. "He aligned himself with monsters who tortured innocents and desecrated the old ways. When he challenged me to single combat, he knew the price of defeat, and now you'll pay the same price." But something had changed in the dynamics of the confrontation. The enemy warriors who had been eager for battle now looked uncertain, even fearful. Facing a legendary warrior was one thing. Facing the most legendary warrior who had ever lived was something else entirely. "Look at them," Freydis whispered to Olaf, noting how the enemy ranks had shifted. "They're afraid." It was true. Men who had sailed across hostile seas and marched through enemy territory to reach this moment were now questioning their resolve. The Berserker's tooth necklace represented not just victories, but impossible victories against foes that should have been unbeatable. Ragnar seemed to sense the change in his followers' mood. "He's still just a man," he roared, trying to shore up their confidence. Older now, softer from years of peace. "The ghost wolf died at Raven's Rock. This is just an echo." But his words lacked conviction, and every warrior present could hear it. The truth was that none of them had ever faced anyone like Hrolf, and the stories of his battles had taken on mythical proportions over the years. Doubt was a poison that spread quickly through an army. "Tell them," Hrolf said quietly, his voice somehow carrying to every corner of the passage. "Tell them about the Battle of Serpent's Bay, where I killed the sea monster that had been sinking their ships. Tell them about the siege of Iron Mountain, where I broke the siege engines with my bare hands. Tell them about your brother's final words before my axe took his head." "Shut up," Ragnar snarled, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold night air. "He begged," Hrolf continued relentlessly. "Not for his life, I'll give him that much honor. He begged me to spare his followers, claimed they were only following orders. I told him the same thing I'll tell you now. Men choose their own paths, and they die for those choices." The psychological warfare was devastating. Ragnar had built his army's confidence on the promise of easy victory over a retired legend. Instead, they found themselves facing the ghost wolf at the height of his terrible glory. Wearing proof of victories that most men thought were myths. "This changes nothing," Ragnar said, but his voice had lost its commanding certainty. "You're still outnumbered, still trapped, still going to die tonight." "Perhaps," Hrolf agreed. "But now your men know who they're truly fighting. Look at them, Ragnar. How many are already calculating the cost of facing me? How many are remembering urgent business elsewhere?" It was then that Freydis noticed something that made her blood run cold. Among the enemy ranks, she could see familiar faces, men who should have been defending the settlement with Skard's forces. The betrayal ran deeper than just Thorwald. Half the supposed defenders had turned, lured by Ragnar's gold or intimidated by his threats. "Hrolf," she whispered urgently, pointing toward the familiar faces. "Look, there's Eagle the Red and Holdor Strongarm. They're supposed to be at the settlement." The implications hit like a physical blow. The ambush at the settlement hadn't failed because of Thorwald's signal. It had failed because the ambushers were working for the enemy. Skard and his loyal men had been betrayed from within, probably slaughtered while expecting support from their own warriors. How many? Hrolf asked quietly, his tactical mind working through the catastrophe. "At least 20 that I recognize," Freydis replied, her voice tight with horror. "Maybe more." The trap was even more complete than they had realized. Ragnar hadn't just brought an army, he had bought one, purchasing loyalty from within Skard's own forces. The gold and promises had been flowing for months, corrupting men who should have died before betraying their oaths. "Did you think I was a fool?" Ragnar asked, having noticed their whispered conversation. "Did you imagine I would assault your stronghold without ensuring victory? Half your defenders wear my gold now. Your Jarl is dead, your hall is burned, and your precious people are scattered to the winds." The words hit Freydis like physical blows. Skard, who had been like a grandfather to her. The other servants who had become friends. Her own father, who might have died while baking bread for warriors who planned to betray him, but instead of breaking her spirit, the revelation kindled something fiercer. Her grandmother's blood sang in her veins as rage replaced fear. These men had not just invaded her home, they had corrupted it from within, turning brother against brother for the promise of foreign gold. "Now do you understand?" Ragnar continued, savoring their despair. "You didn't just fail to protect them, you led them to their deaths with your presence. The ghost wolf brings destruction to everything he touches. It was a masterful psychological assault, designed to break Hrolf's will before the physical combat began. But the effect was exactly opposite of what Ragnar intended. The news of betrayal and slaughter didn't weaken the ghost wolf. It awakened something that had been sleeping for 5 years. When Hrolf raised his head, his eyes held the cold fury that had once broken armies and toppled kingdoms. The peaceful farmer was gone completely now, consumed by the terrible legend that had earned 13 monsters' teeth through blood and determination. "You made one mistake," he said, his voice carrying the promise of death. "You should have killed me first, before touching anything I cared about." The berserker's tooth necklace seemed to glow with malevolent life as the ghost wolf prepared to show Ragnar Bloodeye why legends never truly die. They simply wait for the right moment to remind the world why they became legends in the first place. The ancient ritual combat. Stones had been carved by forgotten hands in the time before memory, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of wind and weather. 13 massive granite monoliths formed a perfect circle in the center of the rocky passage, each one bearing runic inscriptions that spoke of honor, courage, and the sacred nature of single combat. When warriors fought within this circle, the gods themselves were said to bear witness. Hrolf approached the stones with deliberate reverence, each step carrying the weight of tradition that stretched back to the first Vikings who had settled these harsh lands. The berserker's tooth necklace clicked softly against his armor as he moved. 13 trophies from 13 impossible victories, preparing to witness what might be the 14th, or his final defeat. "You know the old laws," he called out to Ragnar, his voice echoing off the ancient stones. "Single combat within the sacred circle. No weapons but what we carry. No armor but what we wear. No mercy but what the gods decree." Ragnar Bloodeye stepped forward, his massive frame impressive even compared to Hrolf's legendary size. The enemy chieftain's black armor was decorated with silver skulls that gleamed in the torchlight, each one representing a settlement he had destroyed or a rival he had defeated. His sword was a masterwork of eastern steel, its blade etched with runes of binding and breaking. "I know the laws," Ragnar replied, his filed teeth creating a gruesome smile. "I also know they favor the younger, stronger warrior. You're past 50 winters, Ghost Wolf. Your legend ends tonight." Around the combat circle, warriors from both sides arranged themselves as witnesses. Even traitors like Thorwald and the corrupted defenders took their places, understanding that some things transcended immediate loyalties. Single combat between legends was sacred, a moment that would be remembered in songs and stories for generations to come. Freydis found herself positioned between Magnus and Olaf, the 2 loyal warriors flanking her protectively despite their own wounds. Her hand rested on her grandmother's silver locket, drawing strength from the memory of Astrid Shieldbearer and the warrior women who had come before. "Has he ever lost?" she whispered, studying Hrolf's face as he prepared for battle. "Not in single combat," Magnus replied quietly. "But Ragnar is younger, fresher, and fighting for blood vengeance. That makes men dangerous." "Dangerous isn't the same as victorious," Olaf added, though his tone carried uncertainty. The transformation taking place within the combat circle was mesmerizing to watch. Hrolf was shedding the last vestiges of the peaceful man he had been, embracing the terrible legend that had dormant within him for 5 years. His movements became more fluid, more predatory. His breathing deepened and slowed. Most tellingly, his eyes took on the distant look of a man who had moved beyond normal human concerns into the realm where only killing mattered. "You feel it, don't you?" Ragnar taunted, noting the change. "The berserker rage building inside you. Your brother told me about it before he died. How the ghost wolf becomes something inhuman when the battle fury takes him." "Your brother talked too much," Hrolf replied, testing the balance of his war axe. "It's a family trait apparently, but Ragnar's words carried truth that couldn't be dismissed. The berserker rage was both blessing and curse. It made a warrior nearly invincible in combat, but it also stripped away humanity and mercy. Men who embraced it fully often couldn't find their way back to civilization afterward. "Tell me," Ragnar continued his psychological assault, What will you become when the rage takes hold? Will you even remember the baker's daughter you're fighting to protect, or will she become just another enemy to slaughter? The question struck home with devastating accuracy. Freydis saw the flicker of doubt cross Hrolf's features, the brief moment of uncertainty that could prove fatal in single combat. The ghost wolf's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. The fury that made him unstoppable also threatened to destroy everything he cared about. "Don't listen to him," she called out, her voice cutting across the circle. "You're not your rage. You're the man who chose to protect rather than destroy." Hrolf's eyes found hers across the combat space, and she saw him anchor himself to that connection. The berserker fury was still building within him, but now it was controlled, directed, shaped by purpose rather than blind hatred. "Touching," Ragnar sneered. "But sentiment won't save you when steel meets steel." The enemy chieftain began his own preparation ritual, drawing power from darker sources. His sword sang as he swung it through practice patterns, the blade leaving trails of shadow in the torchlight. This was not just a warrior, but a practitioner of the old magics, the kind that demanded blood payment and offered strength in return. "Blood for blood," Ragnar chanted, drawing the edge of his sword across his palm. Dark drops fell onto the ancient stones, hissing where they struck. "Pain for pain, death for death." The watching warriors stirred uneasily, as the air itself seemed to thicken with malevolent energy. This was forbidden magic, the kind that had been outlawed by most clans for good reason. But Ragnar had moved beyond such concerns in his quest for vengeance. "You would pollute the sacred circle with blood magic?" Hrolf asked, his voice carrying outrage and disgust. "I would do anything necessary to see you dead," Ragnar replied, his wounds already healing with unnatural speed. "Honor is for those who can afford it." The contrast between the two warriors was stark and telling. Hrolf stood within the circle as a representative of the old ways, honorable, principled, drawing his strength from legitimate sources. Ragnar represented something newer and more corrupt, willing to embrace any darkness that promised power. "Then let us begin," Hrolf said, raising his war axe in formal salute. "May the gods judge between us." The ritual words were spoken, the ancient forms observed. Both warriors took their positions at opposite sides of the circle, weapons ready, eyes locked on each other with the intensity of predators about to strike. Freydis found herself holding her breath as the moment stretched taut. Everything that had happened, the feast, the stranger's threat, the revelation of Hrolf's identity, the betrayal of the defenders, had led to this single moment of confrontation between two legends. "Remember what I taught you," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her. "Remember that legends are made by choices, not just victories." The first move came without warning, both warriors exploding into motion simultaneously. Ragnar's enhanced speed carried him across the circle in a blur of black armor and silver steel. Hrolf met him halfway, war axe describing a perfect arc that would have split an ordinary man from crown to groin. But Ragnar was far from ordinary. His blood magic-enhanced reflexes allowed him to twist aside at the last instant, the ghost wolf's legendary weapon passing within inches of his throat. His own sword struck like a serpent, seeking the gap in Hrolf's armor at the shoulder joint. The opening exchange lasted perhaps 3 heartbeats, both weapons moving too fast for normal eyes to follow. When they separated, both warriors bore new wounds, a shallow cut along Ragnar's ribs, a deeper gash across Hrolf's forearm. "First blood to you," Ragnar admitted, touching the wound with satisfaction. "But I heal faster now." Indeed, the cut along his ribs was already closing, the blood magic working its dark purpose. Hrolf's wound continued to bleed normally, putting him at a significant disadvantage in any prolonged fight. "Magic is a crutch," Hrolf replied, adjusting his grip on the war axe. "It makes you forget how to rely on skill. We'll see." They circled each other within the stone ring, each looking for an opening, an advantage, a moment of weakness to exploit. The watching warriors followed every movement with rapt attention, understanding they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after they were all dead. Freydis noticed something the others had missed. The way Hrolf's movements were becoming more fluid, more inhuman. The berserker rage was building within him, but it was controlled rage, shaped by decades of experience and anchored by his determination to protect rather than simply destroy. When the second exchange came, it was even more violent than the first. Weapons clashed with the sound of breaking thunder, sparks flying as steel met steel in a symphony of destruction. Both warriors pressed their attacks with lethal intensity, neither giving ground, neither showing mercy. But something had changed in Hrolf's fighting style. The peaceful farmer was gone completely now, replaced by the ghost wolf in all his terrible glory. His war axe moved like a living thing, finding openings that shouldn't have existed, striking with precision that transcended normal human ability. The final battle had truly begun. The formal challenge echoed across the ancient combat circle as both warriors assumed their fighting stances. By blood and steel, by honor and vengeance. "Let the gods judge between us," Ragnar called out, his voice carrying the ritual words that had preceded single combat for 1,000 years. "Witnessed and accepted," Hrolf replied, the ghost wolf's legendary battle fury beginning to build within him like a gathering storm. The berserker's tooth necklace seemed to pulse with malevolent life against his chest as he raised his war axe in formal salute. The initial exchange came with explosive violence that made the very stones tremble. Ragnar's blood-enhanced speed carried him forward in a blur of motion, his eastern sword seeking the gap beneath Hrolf's arm. But the ghost wolf was no longer fighting as a man. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator born to kill. His war axe intercepting the strike with perfect timing. Steel rang against steel in a shower of sparks as both weapons locked together, the warriors straining against each other with inhuman strength. Ragnar's filed teeth gleamed in the torchlight as he pressed his advantage, the dark magic flowing through his veins, granting power beyond mortal limits. "You're slower than the stories claimed," he snarled, breaking the lock and spinning away from Hrolf's counterattack. "I'm older than when the stories were made," Hrolf replied calmly, already moving to cut off Ragnar's escape route. "But some things improve with age." The second exchange proved his point with devastating clarity. Where Ragnar relied on enhanced speed and brute force, Hrolf fought with the accumulated wisdom of 13 legendary victories. His axe work was poetry written in steel, each strike flowing into the next. Every movement calculated to maximum effect. Ragnar found himself forced backward as the ghost wolf pressed his attack with relentless precision. The enemy chieftain's swordwork was impressive, but it lacked the refined lethality that came from decades of impossible battles. Magic could enhance physical abilities, but it couldn't replace experience. "Impossible," Ragnar gasped, barely deflecting a strike that would have taken his head. "The blood magic makes me stronger than any mortal man." "That's your mistake," Hrolf said, his war axe describing a perfect figure 8 that forced Ragnar to give more ground. "You're fighting a mortal man. I stopped being mortal 20 years ago." The watching warriors followed every movement with mesmerized attention, understanding they were witnessing something beyond normal human combat. This was legend fighting legend, mythical skills clashing in a contest that would be remembered in songs for generations. Freydis pressed her grandmother's locket against her heart, drawing strength from the memory of Astrid's shield-bearer. The woman who had raised her would have understood this moment, the point where ordinary people transcended their limitations through sheer force of will. "He's beautiful," she whispered, watching Hrolf transform into something barely human. The ghost wolf fought like death incarnate, his movements flowing with deadly grace that made even his enemies pause in awe. But beauty and terror were closely related when witnessing the berserker's art. Hrolf's eyes had taken on the distant look of a man who existed beyond normal human concerns, focused entirely on the lethal mathematics of combat. Every strike was calculated for maximum damage, every defense positioned to create new attacking opportunities. Ragnar's confidence began to waver as his enhanced abilities proved insufficient against legendary skill. The blood magic that should have guaranteed victory was being systematically dismantled by superior technique and battle-tested experience. "Stand still and die," he roared, launching a desperate assault with all his remaining strength. The berserker charge was impressive, a blur of black armor and silver steel that would have overwhelmed most opponents. But Hrolf was not most opponents. He was the Ghost Wolf, and legends didn't die easily. The counterattack came with surgical precision. Hrolf stepped aside at the last possible moment, allowing Ragnar's momentum to carry him past, then struck with his war axe in a rising arc that caught the enemy chieftain across the ribs. The blow would have killed an ordinary man instantly. Ragnar's enhanced constitution kept him alive, but dark blood flowed freely from the wound despite his magical healing. Some injuries were too severe for even blood magic to immediately repair. "First lesson," Hrolf said quietly, resetting his stance as Ragnar staggered backward. "Magic is a tool, not a replacement for skill." The enemy chieftain pressed his hand against the wound, feeling his supernatural strength beginning to ebb as his life force leaked away. The dark magic demanded constant feeding, and serious injuries disrupted its flow. "This isn't over," he snarled, raising his sword with visible effort. "No," Hrolf agreed, the Ghost Wolf's terrible smile promising death. "But it's ending." The final phase of their combat was about to begin, and every warrior present could sense the shift in momentum. The legendary Ghost Wolf was awakening fully now, shedding the last vestiges of peaceful humanity to become the killing machine that had broken armies and toppled kingdoms. Ragnar Bloodeye was about to learn why some legends never truly die. The combat reached its fever pitch as both warriors embraced their full, deadly potential. Ragnar's blood magic flared one final time, granting him supernatural speed and strength as he launched himself across the circle with berserker fury. His ancestral sword, passed down through 3 generations of blood-eye chieftains, sang through the air with lethal intent. But Hrolf had finally released the controlled berserker rage that made him legend. The Ghost Wolf erupted into full manifestation, his war axe moving with inhuman precision as 20 years of suppressed warrior instinct exploded into action. Yet unlike Ragnar's mindless fury, this was rage tempered by wisdom, enhanced by experience, and directed by the clear purpose of protecting what he loved. The collision between them sent shockwaves through the ancient stones. Ragnar's enhanced strength met Hrolf's legendary skill in a clash that transcended normal human combat. Both warriors moved faster than mortal eyes could follow, their weapons describing patterns of destruction that painted death across the torchlit circle. "You should have stayed dead," Ragnar roared, his sword seeking Hrolf's heart with desperate fury. "Death comes for us all," Hrolf replied with supernatural calm, his axe turning the blade aside. "But not tonight. Not for me." The decisive moment came without warning. Ragnar pressed his final assault with everything remaining, strength, speed, and the last dregs of his blood magic. His sword struck like lightning, aimed at the gap in Hrolf's armor where victory waited. But legends are forged in moments exactly like this. The Ghost Wolf's response was perfection itself, a counterattack that flowed from defense to offense with seamless grace. His war axe caught Ragnar's blade at the exact moment of overextension, and the ancient steel of the Blood-Eye sword finally met its match. The ancestral weapon shattered with a sound like breaking thunder. Centuries of family honor, 3 generations of victories, and Ragnar's dreams of vengeance exploded into fragments of useless metal. The broken blade scattered across the sacred stones like falling stars, each piece catching the torchlight before clattering into darkness. Ragnar stared at the broken hilt in his hand, understanding flooding his eyes, along with the knowledge of defeat. The blood magic that had sustained him flickered and died, leaving him merely mortal once again. The Ghost Wolf stood before him, war axe poised for the killing blow. Victory written in every line of his legendary form. "Your brother's sword served him better," Hrolf said quietly, holding death at bay for one final moment. At least it stayed whole until the end. "My brother," Ragnar gasped, his wound bleeding freely now that the magic had failed. "Tell me, did he die well?" The question held genuine pain beneath its surface, the cry of a younger brother who had loved despite everything that came after. Hrolf studied the defeated chieftain's face, seeing past the filed teeth and ritual scars, to the man who had once idolized an older sibling. "He died fighting," Hrolf replied with unexpected gentleness. "He met his end with courage, facing me rather than running. He spoke your name at the last." Tears mixed with blood on Ragnar's face as the weight of 20 years finally lifted from his shoulders. The vengeance that had driven him across hostile seas and through countless battles was revealed as what it had always been, a younger brother's desperate attempt to honor the dead. "Then it's finished," he said, letting the broken sword fall from his fingers. "Do what you must." But instead of delivering the killing blow, Hrolf lowered his war axe. The berserker rage that had transformed him into a living weapon began to recede, revealing the man beneath the legend once again. "Your brother's debt was paid at Raven's Rock," he said firmly. "You chose to extend it with treachery and betrayal. But the circle demands honor, even in death. The ancient combat laws were clear. Defeated enemies who fought with courage deserved honorable death, not butchery. Ragnar had corrupted himself with blood magic and treachery, but he had faced the ghost wolf in single combat without flinching. "I grant you warrior's death," Hrolf announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the circle. "Die with your weapons in your hands, knowing your brother's name is honored." He placed his own war dagger in Ragnar's failing grip, the ancient ritual of respect between warriors. The defeated chieftain managed one final smile, not the gruesome expression of filed teeth, but something almost peaceful. "Thank you," Ragnar whispered, then drove the blade into his own heart with the last of his strength. The enemy chieftain died as he had lived, by violence. But this death carried dignity that his life had lacked. The final gift of an enemy who chose honor over hatred in the end. The watching warriors erupted in thunderous cheers as the ghost wolf's victory was confirmed. The legendary warrior stood alone in the center of the combat circle, Ragnar's blood pooling around his feet, the berserker's tooth necklace gleaming against his chest. But Freydis saw what the others missed, the moment when legend became man again, when the killing machine transformed back into someone capable of mercy and compassion. The ghost wolf had won his final battle. Now came the harder task of learning to live with peace once more. The new hearthstone was carved from granite, taken from the very circle where legends had clashed, its surface polished smooth and inscribed with symbols that spoke of peace, protection, and new beginnings. Hrolf had cut it himself over the course of many evenings, his weathered hands working the stone with the same precision he had once applied to weapons of war. It now rested at the center of their modest home, radiating warmth that had nothing to do with the fire that burned upon it. 6 months had passed since the battle in the Western Passage, and the settlement bore new scars alongside new hope. The great hall had been rebuilt larger than before, its timbers seasoned with the memory of those who had died defending it. Jarl Skard's son had taken his father's place, young but wise enough to value the counsel of legendary warriors who chose to stay rather than seek new glories. Freydis emerged from their small kitchen carrying a tray laden with fresh bread, salted fish, and the honey mead that had become Hrolf's particular weakness. She moved with the confident grace of a woman who had found her place in the world, no longer the nervous serving girl who had trembled before drunken warriors. Her auburn hair was braided in the style of married women, and her green eyes held depths of experience that made her seem older than her 20 winters. "The scouts returned this morning," she said, settling beside Hrolf on the wooden bench that faced their hearthstone. "No sign of enemy activity along the coastal routes. It seems your reputation continues to discourage unwanted visitors." Hrolf accepted the offered mead with a grunt of satisfaction. The peaceful routine of their shared life still felt miraculous after the chaos of his legendary past. Fear is a useful tool when applied correctly. Better than having to kill them all. You've changed, she observed, studying his profile in the firelight. 6 months ago, you would have said killing them would be simpler. 6 months ago, I had less to protect. It was true. The ghost wolf still lived within him, would always live within him, but it had found new purpose in guarding rather than destroying. The berserker rage that had once consumed entire battlefields now served as a deterrent, its very existence ensuring that their small corner of the world remained peaceful. The sound of approaching footsteps announced visitors. Magnus Swordbreaker and Olaf the Tall appeared in their doorway, both men bearing the relaxed expressions of warriors who had found good service under a just lord. Their wounds from the final battle had healed well, leaving only scars to mark their part in the legendary confrontation. "The young Jarl wants to see you," Magnus announced, settling onto a stool near the fire. "There's been another request for your services, some king in the Eastern Kingdoms facing a dragon problem." Hrolf didn't even look up from his mead. "Tell him I'm retired." "That's what we said," Olaf chuckled. "But the offered payment would buy 3 new longships and enough silver to last until the next ice age." "Money doesn't interest me." "The dragon has been eating entire villages," Magnus pressed, "women and children included. They're desperate enough to offer anything for the ghost wolf's help." For a moment, the old fire flickered in Hrolf's eyes, the instinctive response of a man who had built his legend on protecting the innocent. But then he felt Freydis's hand cover his own, anchoring him to the life they had built together. "Send them my regrets," he said finally. "Let someone else be the hero this time." Magnus and Olaf exchanged glances that mixed surprise with approval. They had served with the ghost wolf long enough to understand the significance of his choice. Legends who learned to value peace over glory were rare. Most burned out in blasts of violent heroism rather than growing into wisdom. "The young Jarl thought you might say that," Magnus continued with a slight smile. "He asked us to remind you that legends aren't just about the battles they fight, but about the communities they choose to protect." "Clever boy," Hrolf admitted. His father would be proud. As evening deepened into night, their guests departed for their own homes and families. The settlement had grown in the months following the battle, drawing people who valued the security that came from living under the protection of a legendary warrior. But it remained a place where neighbors knew each other's names and children played safely in the streets. Freydis banked the fire for the night while Hrolf secured the door and checked the simple defenses that surrounded their home. Old habits died hard, even in peacetime. But these were the comfortable routines of a man who had found his proper place in the world. "Do you miss it?" she asked as they prepared for bed. "The glory, the songs, the way men's eyes lit up when they heard your name?" Hrolf considered the question seriously, as he did all her inquiries into his feelings. "I miss the certainty," he said finally. "When I was the ghost wolf, I always knew what I was supposed to do. Find the monster, kill the monster, move on to the next monster. This is more complicated, but better. Much better." She smiled and kissed him gently, a gesture that still amazed him with its casual intimacy. That someone could touch the ghost wolf without fear, could see past the legend to the man beneath, seemed like a miracle he would never fully understand. As they settled into their shared bed, Freydis wearing her grandmother's locket, and Hrolf still bearing the berserker's tooth necklace, both understood that they had found something rarer than gold or glory. They had found peace, not the peace of the grave, but the living peace that came from choosing to build rather than destroy. Outside their window, the settlement slept safely under the protection of legends who had learned that the greatest victory was knowing when to stop fighting. The ghost wolf had fought his final battle and discovered that true strength lay not in the ability to kill, but in the wisdom to choose life instead. In the morning, there would be bread to bake, fields to tend, and the simple pleasures of a life well lived. It was, Hrolf thought as sleep claimed him, exactly the ending his legend deserved.